The Bitterroot Valley in western Montana had seen hard winters before, but nothing like the one that arrived in December of 1881. This was not the kind of cold that surprised people for a night or two and then passed. This was a cold that settled in and stayed, pressing down on the land like a heavy weight. Snow covered the ground early and deep, piling against fences, burying trails, and turning the valley into a white, silent basin surrounded by dark mountains. When the temperatures dropped, they did not stop at zero. They slid past it without hesitation and kept falling until the mercury rested near -30 degrees, where it stayed for days at a time. Men who had lived in the valley for decades said they had never felt anything like it. The cold crept into bones, cracked wood, froze metal, and punished every mistake. Survival became a daily task, measured not in comfort but in hours of warmth. Every homestead in the valley responded the same way. Fires burned constantly. Chimneys smoked day and night, sending thick black plumes into the frozen air. Inside the cabins, stoves glowed red, and men woke every few hours to feed them more wood. Axes rang out from morning until dusk as settlers split logs as fast as their frozen hands would allow. Woodpiles shrank faster than anyone expected. Even well-prepared families began to worry. Some rationed heat, letting fires die down at night and pulling blankets tighter around their children. Others burned furniture, fence posts, anything that would catch fire. The valley smelled of smoke and desperation, because heat was the only thing standing between life and death. At the far edge of the valley, beyond the old sawmill and down a narrow trail few people traveled in winter, stood a small structure that did not seem to belong. It was not square like the other cabins. It had no vertical walls, no visible roofline separate from its sides. It rose from the snow like a sharp triangle, steep and compact, with its roof sweeping all the way down to the ground. While every other cabin in the valley breathed smoke like a living thing struggling to stay alive, this one barely smoked at all. Its chimney released only a thin, lazy line into the air, as if the fire inside was barely working. People noticed. At first, they assumed the man inside was freezing. The cabin belonged to Caleb Hardin, a sawmill worker with no reputation, no special training, and no money to waste. Caleb was not a builder by trade. He had grown up in logging camps, learning how to put up sheds and equipment shelters quickly, using whatever materials were available. These were not homes. They were temporary structures meant to keep tools dry and animals sheltered from snow. When Caleb bought 40 acres of rocky land at the edge of the valley, he knew he needed a place to live before winter arrived. What he did not have was time or help. The experienced builders in the area were already booked through the fall, raising proper log cabins for families who could afford them. Winter was only 6 weeks away, and Caleb was on his own. He took stock of what he had. Some rough-cut lumber from the sawmill. Hand tools. Access to a creek full of flat river stone. He did not have enough timber to build thick log walls, nor the time to stack and chink them properly. What he did have was experience building A-frame sheds. They went up fast. Their steep roofs shed snow easily. They required fewer materials and fewer hands. Standing alone on his land, watching the days shorten and the air grow colder, Caleb made a decision that no one else in the valley would have made. He decided to live in an A-frame. When his neighbors saw the structure taking shape, they stopped to stare. The roof pitched sharply upward, forming a tall triangle that ran straight down to the foundation on both sides. There were no traditional walls, no loft, no second story. It looked temporary, unfinished, and wrong. One neighbor, a man named Fenton, stopped his horse and shook his head when he saw it. He asked Caleb if that was really going to be his cabin. Caleb said it would do. Fenton laughed and told him it looked like a shed. Sheds kept things dry, Caleb replied. They didn't keep men warm, Fenton said. Caleb didn't argue. He went back to work. The foundation Caleb built was stone, laid 2 feet above the frozen ground. He hauled flat river rock from the creek bed, stones the size of dinner plates, heavy and dense. He fitted them together carefully, packing clay and sand between the gaps. The floor inside was stone as well, covered with more sand and clay and then capped with another layer of flat rock. People who passed by shook their heads. Everyone knew stone floors were cold. Stone sucked heat from a room and held onto it. A wooden floor would have been warmer, they said. But stone was free, and lumber was not. Caleb worked with what he had. At the center of the cabin, he placed a small iron stove. It was not impressive. Other men in the valley had large fireboxes designed to burn huge amounts of wood. Caleb's stove was modest, almost undersized by local standards. Around it, he stacked more stone, building a wide, low platform that extended several feet in every direction. By the time he finished, nearly 2 tons of rock sat inside the cabin. Caleb did not call it anything special. He simply wanted something solid under the stove and a floor that would not rot. He did not talk about heat storage or efficiency. He just worked. By mid-October, the cabin was complete. It sat low and compact, its steep sides making it look almost predatory, like it was crouching against the coming winter. People stopped waving when they passed. Some looked away, embarrassed on Caleb's behalf. One woman said outright that it looked like a tent someone had given up on. The valley had a clear idea of what a proper cabin should look like, and this was not it. Traditional cabins had thick log walls, square corners, and lofts where heat could rise and gather. Caleb's cabin violated every rule they trusted. When November arrived, snow followed quickly. Then the temperatures dropped. At first, it was manageable. Below zero at night, warming slightly during the day. But as December approached, the cold deepened. Fires burned longer. Woodpiles shrank. Inside his A-frame, Caleb kept his fire low. He sealed the door tightly. He used moss and clay to fill every seam. While others stoked roaring flames, Caleb fed his stove gently. He burned 4 or 5 logs a day. People noticed and whispered. They assumed he was either lying or suffering in silence. By mid-December, the valley learned what real cold felt like. -30 degrees arrived and refused to leave. The kind of cold that split tree trunks and froze rivers solid. The kind that punished poorly sealed cabins and exposed every weakness. Wind followed, driving the cold into cracks people did not know existed. Cabins that had felt solid for years suddenly felt thin and porous. Heat poured out. Cold poured in. Fires burned hotter than ever, yet the interiors stayed cold. Men grew exhausted from feeding stoves through the night. Some families ran low on fuel and began to fear what would happen if the cold did not break. Through all of it, Caleb's cabin remained quiet. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. His woodpile stayed small. One afternoon, Fenton passed by and saw Caleb outside splitting a few logs in the pale winter sun. The pile was modest, nothing like the stacks other men were working through. Fenton asked how much wood Caleb was burning. 4 or 5 logs, Caleb said. Maybe less on calm days. Fenton frowned and told him he must be freezing. Caleb shrugged and said he was fine. Fenton did not believe him. The assumption spread through the valley that Caleb's cabin was a mistake that Winter had not finished punishing yet. People said he would be begging for help by Christmas. Some said he was too proud to admit he was cold. Others said he would freeze trying to prove a point. Even Orson Teague, the most respected builder in the region, stopped by and told Caleb plainly that the cabin was not built for winter. Teague explained that steep walls leaked heat, stone floors stole warmth, and without a loft, heat would rise and escape. Caleb listened politely, thanked him, and went back to his work. When the cold reached its worst, the valley began to break. Families rationed heat. Water froze inside cabins. Children slept fully clothed under piles of blankets. Fenton's solid log cabin burned through 6 cords of wood in a week, and still the temperature inside hovered near 50 degrees. Bridger's loft trapped heat upstairs, leaving the living space cold and miserable. Teague's large, well-built home required constant feeding just to remain tolerable. People stopped visiting one another because leaving a warm cabin meant losing precious heat. On the 5th day of relentless wind, Fenton finally walked to Caleb's cabin. He knocked on the door and waited. When Caleb opened it, he was wearing only a shirt. Warm air flowed out into the frozen daylight. Fenton stepped inside and felt the heat wrap around him. Not the harsh blast of an overheated stove, but steady, even warmth. The floor beneath his boots was warm. He crouched and touched the stone. It was warm to the hand, even several feet from the stove. The fire itself was low, mostly coals. Caleb said he had fed it hours earlier. Fenton walked around the small interior, noticing how compact it felt. There was no loft. No high ceiling where heat could disappear. The steep walls rose sharply and met at a narrow peak, forcing warmth back into the living space. There were no drafts. No cold corners. Everything felt contained. Fenton asked how much wood Caleb was actually burning. 3 or 4 logs, Caleb said. Fenton did the math in his head and realized he was burning nearly 5 times that amount just to stay colder. The next morning, Fenton returned with Bridger. Bridger brought a thermometer, determined to prove that something was being exaggerated. The fire in Caleb's cabin had gone out the night before. 12 hours later, the thermometer read 54 degrees. Outside, the temperature hovered just above 0. Bridger stared at the numbers. Then he felt the floor. Still warm. He understood then what no one else had seen. The stone was not stealing heat. It was storing it. The cabin was not wasting energy heating air that escaped. It was charging a massive thermal battery and releasing that heat slowly over time. Word spread quickly. Not as rumors, but as measurements. 12 hours. 54 degrees. Half the wood. Even Teague came to see it. He did not argue. He did not explain. He stood in the cabin, felt the warmth rising from the stone, and left without a word. 2 weeks later, he began laying stone floors in his own home. By spring, the valley had changed. The A-frame was no longer a joke. It was a lesson. 3 more were built that year, each adapted slightly to the builder's needs. Steeper roofs. Different stone. More insulation. But all shared the same principles. Compact space. Heavy thermal mass. Tight ceiling. Minimal waste. Caleb never claimed to invent anything. He simply used what he had and built what made sense. The valley learned something important that winter. Efficiency was not about tradition. It was about understanding heat, mass, and geometry. When fuel was scarce and cold was constant, small, steep, heavy structures outperformed big, hollow ones every time. Caleb's cabin stood for 43 years. It did not fail because of rot or collapse. It was torn down only when the land was needed for a road. But the idea remained. Small A-frame structures with stone floors became part of the valley's quiet knowledge, passed from one builder to the next. The lesson was simple. A small A-frame cabin used less wood and stayed warmer because it respected how heat actually works. It did not fight winter with bigger fires. It worked with physics. And sometimes, the structure everyone laughs at is the one that survives when it matters most. The winter of 1881 did not fade from memory when the snow finally melted. Long after the last ice broke on the creek and the valley turned green again, people still spoke about that cold in low voices, as if it might hear them and return. They remembered the sound of trees cracking in the night, the way breath froze in beards, the way firewood vanished faster than it could be cut. And they remembered the strange little A-frame at the edge of the valley that had endured it all quietly, without drama, without desperation. Spring revealed the cost of winter. Fences sagged where posts had been burned for heat. Cabins leaned where logs had split and shifted under extreme cold. Some families moved away. Floors stayed warmer longer. Fires didn't need to roar. Cabins cooled more slowly overnight. The men who had once laughed at Caleb's structure now defended it when outsiders questioned it. By the third winter, the A-frame no longer seemed strange. It was still uncommon, but it was understood. Hunters built them as seasonal shelters. Ranchers used them as bunkhouses. Some families even downsized, building smaller homes after realizing how much energy they had wasted heating empty air. The valley slowly shifted away from size and toward efficiency, though no one used that word. Children who had grown up through the winter of 1881 carried its lessons into adulthood. They remembered the fear in their parents' faces when wood ran low. They remembered cold floors and frozen walls. When they built homes of their own, they asked different questions. How warm will it stay when the fire goes out? How much heat will the floor hold? Where will warmth escape? The answers mattered more than appearances. Caleb married late. When he did, his wife did not complain about the cabin. She liked its warmth, its quiet, its simplicity. They raised 2 children there. The stone floor that once drew criticism became a place where babies crawled comfortably even in winter. The steep walls made the space feel protected, like a nest against the mountain winds. The cabin was small, but it never felt lacking. Over time, other builders refined the idea. Some added small lofts with low ceilings. Others combined stone and wood in new ways. A few experimented with earth piled against the sides for even more insulation. But the core idea remained unchanged. Keep the space compact. Use mass to store heat. Seal every gap. Let shape work for you instead of against you. Years later, a traveling engineer passed through the valley. He noticed the unusual number of steep-roofed, low-profile buildings and asked questions. When people explained, he smiled and said they had discovered thermal mass and surface area efficiency without knowing the terms. He sketched diagrams in the dirt, showing how heat escaped from large, boxy structures faster than from compact shapes. The valley listened politely, but they didn't need diagrams. They had lived it. The engineer visited Caleb's cabin before leaving. He complimented the design and asked who had taught him. Caleb said no one. He said winter had taught him. The engineer laughed and said winter was a harsh but effective teacher. As decades passed, technology changed. Better stoves arrived. New insulation materials became available. But the principles remained the same. Even the most modern cabins in the valley borrowed from the old A-frame idea, whether people admitted it or not. Steeper roofs. Lower ceilings. Stone hearths. Smaller footprints. The influence was everywhere, woven quietly into the valley's building habits. When Caleb grew old, he spent winters sitting near the stove, feeling warmth rise from the stone just as it always had. He never spoke of innovation or efficiency. He spoke of comfort, of peace, of not having to fight the cold. When neighbors complained about firewood, he listened without boasting. He knew how close winter could push people to the edge. The year the cabin was torn down, people gathered to watch. The road expansion had been planned for years. Caleb had already moved into town. As the structure came apart, men were surprised by how solid it still was. The stone floor took the longest to dismantle, still tight and heavy after 4 decades. Someone joked that it could survive another 40 years. Someone else said it already had. After it was gone, the land looked strangely empty. But the idea had already spread too far to disappear. The A-frame cabin had done its work. It had changed how people thought about shelter, not through theory, but through survival. The story continued to be told, especially during hard winters. Parents told children about the winter when fires never slept and wood ran out. They told them about the small triangular cabin that stayed warm when others struggled. They told them not to ignore simple solutions just because they looked different. The lesson endured because it was earned. A small A-frame cabin used less wood and stayed warmer because it respected the rules of nature instead of trying to overpower them. It accepted limits. It worked within them. And when winter tested everything the valley believed about shelter, it passed quietly, without smoke or struggle. Long after Caleb Hardin's name faded from memory, his cabin's shape remained, rising again and again wherever people understood that warmth is not about how much you burn, but about how wisely you build. As the years went on, the valley changed, but winter never stopped being winter. Some seasons were gentler, others nearly as cruel as the one in 1881, but every cold spell revived old memories. Whenever the temperature dropped suddenly or snow piled faster than expected, people remembered how fragile comfort could be. They remembered that warmth was not guaranteed just because a cabin looked solid. That awareness settled into the culture of the place, shaping how people prepared, built, and thought new. Over time, Elias became known for building homes that were warm without waste. He never advertised, yet families noticed their wood lasted longer and their homes stayed calm and steady. As technology changed, the lesson remained the same: well-built homes survived storms, outages, and hard winters better than large ones. The valley learned that warmth was not about big fires or excess, but about smart design, preparation, and respect for how heat truly works.